Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. We certainly have a lot to talk about this morning. Take a minute and like the video, share it with on your social media and everything else. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We just hit 11,000 subscribers, which thank you to each and every one of you. I'm not, I did put our Patreon and stuff in the show description, but I actually meant to take it out. I want to say that, people should support the Samir Project today if they have any means to do so. And I'm just going to share, in case people didn't see this really quickly. Their link is in the show description. But unfortunately, yesterday, Musab, who's the Samir Project describes him as being the Samir Project. He was a camp manager, ran all of their initiatives in the south of Gaza, and just you can read on and on in this post. I'll add it to the show description. But he was killed yesterday by the Zionists, and I just want folks to recognize, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about why in this show, but I think most of you that are listening and understand why it's important to continue to support people in Gaza right now. And the Samir Project is, of course, vowing to continue the work that he was a key part of in Gaza, which is just essential. We've done a couple of live streams with them, or at least one live stream and one audio podcast with Hala Sabah, who is, one of their coordinators. And yeah, I'll bring Abdaljawad on, and we can talk a little bit more about kind of what's going on in Gaza, because two of the pieces that are we're discussing three of Abdul-Jawad's articles today, and two of them are about Gaza. One is about the aid traps, basically, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and we talked about that a lot in our last episode, but we'll talk a little bit more about it today. And the other is about the the gang, basically, or the gangs that Israel has been supporting in Gaza, and both of these structures work together to produce incredibly dehumanized conditions on top of this genocidal war that, or as a part of this genocidal war that people in Gaza have been dealing with for 20 some months. And so obviously we're going to talk a lot about Iran and Israel today as well, but just want to point people there to start to ground us. Abdaljawad Omar is a writer. He's an analyst. He's been on our show 20 times now, since the start, since October 7th. I believe we started in November of 2023. And he's written extensively in Arabic, in English. A lot of his writing has been with Mondoweiss lately. If you don't, that's another thing to do, is just support Mondoweiss and the work that they do and the people that they publish. So we have a playlist with 20 conversations that we've had, and I'm sure a lot of you have watched many or all of them, but I encourage you to watch all of them. They cover a lot of important analysis and work from Abdaljawad. So Abdaljawad, welcome back. It's always good to be with you. Obviously we have a lot to talk about today.
Thanks, Jared. It's good to be with you again.
Yeah, let's just start a little bit with Gaza. I mean, obviously there's the main thing that is on all of our minds right now, obviously, is this escalation of Israel starting a war with Iran, which they started, I believe, on Thursday, although the days are weird because sometimes you guys are ahead of us. But so we'll definitely want to get to that discussion. But amid that, what I've seen also is that the massacres at the site of aid, there's more footage that's coming out of what this looks like when Gazans are trying to sleep overnight, to get access to aid in the morning, and then just in a desperation to get food. And there was a full media blackout because they cut the internet was successfully shut down for 3 or 4 days. And that footage is starting to come out. It's starting to come back, the internet. And it seems that Israel, intended or not, they certainly used the war with Iran, I think, to even escalate, kind of, and as well as the internet blackout, to kind of escalate their violence in Gaza as well. And you've written quite a bit about the point of these aid traps, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So you want to say a little bit about that up front before we move into a discussion of Iran, and we'll come back to it later on as well.
Well, what's going on in Gaza, Jared, is that the tempo and rhythm of the genocide remains quite intact in terms of the daily massacres, of course, and choking Gaza, occupying around a third, trying to back forces like gangs within it, at the same time using aid as a weapon of war, and as a new design for massacres, while also, at this current moment, paving through the attack on Iran for, a distraction from the Gaza and its genocide, and a reassertion, of course, of Western collective backing of Israel and support at a time when some gestures were emerging from some European leaders, specifically, that started to pinpoint towards perhaps some sanctions towards some leaders, like what the UK did with the ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, or things along those lines that are happening within multiple diplomatic forums. Of course, I'm not saying that these are important moves by themselves, but I see them more cynically as tactics of containment and attempts to actually contain whatever public anger there is across various countries and within the still quite alive people's movements in support of Palestine and the Palestinian people in Gaza specifically. So I think that's the picture is like that. Of course, Israel announced some troop redeployments because it wants to create more solidification of its northern borders, out of fear of the forces that are allied with Iran, and specifically in Iraq, some in Syria and others in Lebanon, interjecting or interfering or conducting operations within Israeli within Israeli borders, through these borders. So there's that kind of redeployment, at least at some level. And of course, the resistance in Gaza remains alive and well. Daily there's announcements of new operations. We're seeing, increasing number of Israeli soldiers injured, and of course, some are killed. Most recently, another 2 were killed in ambushes by the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip. So this is the picture in Gaza. What is, of course, worrying is that what is happening in Iran would provide the final blow to Gaza and provision Israel with the ability, through a more regional, intense fight with Iran and other forces, specifically if the Americans enter, to start the process of ethnically cleansing Gaza. So this is one of the worries of what the Israeli move means, or could open up potentially as a political possibility for the Israelis, defying, of course, the will of Egyptian state that at this moment and still remains firmly against any opening of the borders between Egypt and Gaza. So that's one worry of what might be the outcome of such a regional conflict that is escalating by the minute. But yeah, that's all. Of course, we're gonna come back to some of the particulars, so I don't want to speak more on that. Yeah.
No, that's fine. I appreciate it. Well, let's talk obviously about the events of the past few days, and so um, you had this, you know, this claim. There was a report that came out, and I know there's a lot of contestation about the report, but that basically Iran was not following certain expectations around how it was, using its uranium and so on. And, this was used as a pretext by Israel for what was, a totally, unprovoked, escalation and attack on Iran, including the assassination of, several officials, scientists, physicists, and the start of a war. I mean, it was obviously read by Iranians as a declaration of war, and I think rightfully so. I think any country would feel that way if that was done to them. And they've responded. There's been a lot of back and forth. There is a lot of fog of war in any conflict like this, and so there's a lot of claims that have been made specifically by Israel that seem to not be don't seem to be true on the ground when you talk to Iranians. Like, for instance, this notion that they're just able to fly freely throughout the country and bomb. It seems like a lot of what has happened is that there are drones that were inside of Iran that were activated. And so anyway, so I don't want to say more. So talk a little bit about, your read of the last few days and what you think is important, and we can get into the discussion from there.
Well, like from the outset, it seems that the Iranians were, caught with their pants down in the first initial moments. I think they haven't really considered the fact that Israel might initiate an attack and engage in this kind of plan to both assassinate some of the key military commanders and some of the nuclear scientists, and of course with their families. And it's important to note that because many civilians were killed in these assassinations. And at the same time, hit some of the Iranian assets militarily, or some of the nuclear reactors, or attempting to hit them at least. We still don't know the extent of the damage, whether the damage actually severely hurt, is Iranian nuclear facilities or not. There are some reports here and there, but nothing really affirmative. But what is certain is that, Israel's initial blow, despite its, these elements that we spoke about earlier, like it's seeking to create this kind of shock and awe moment, and I think was not, that it did not produce the effects that the Israelis wanted, because the Iranians were easily regaining the initiative as well, balance a bit of their initial knock, and were able almost within 16 to 18 hours to start launching ballistic missiles towards Israel. And the ballistic barrages are still happening on a daily basis, around 2 to 3 every day, or specifically at night, of course. So this is the initial attack. I mean, it goes back to this combination in Israeli mentality between an insistence on, I wouldn't insistence, but this kind of beyond the aesthetic element, this whole shock and awe and the psychology around it, which is kind of a repetition of an Israeli old military design around what they did to the Egyptian Air Force in the initial attacks against Egypt in 1967, for instance, and Syria, and neutralizing the air forces. The Israelis seem to be like in this drive to repeat similar actions. It relatively worked in the context, for instance, of Hezbollah, with the penetration of some of its communication devices, and of course the assassination of some of the leaders. But I think Iran is a different level. not only in terms of geography, not only in terms of military capability, but also in terms of Iranian, military doctrine, which is, of course, state-oriented, but actually, in fact, acts also similar to many of the resistance movement it backs, in the way that it does not really try to contend terrain where the enemy, Israel or America has advantages. It actually invests more heavily in things that give it a qualitative edge, such as missile technology, for instance, or hiding their military assets deep within underground, creating conditions where a sustained military campaign against Iran would also be one that will take a lot of effort, money, and of course a lot of engagement for it to be near any success, first of all in neutralizing its nuclear facilities, but also more importantly in actually really truly hurting its military capabilities, including its capability, which is still not played until this moment, to close the Strait of both Hormuz and Mandeb. We should remember that Ansarullah in Yemen, an ally of Iran, could also close that strait, and then you would have a deep, severe economic crisis, not only for many of the states that are dependent on oil coming from the Persian Gulf, but also for the entire global economy that would face, increasing risk on inflation and recession more broadly. So still, the game is still in its beginnings. I think the Israeli attack, of course, significant with its precise intelligence, its ability to kill. I think that on some level, despite its success and significance, it's limited in its effects. It did not really neutralize the nuclear program. It could actually push Iran to also acquire nuclear weapons. And at the same time, until this moment at least, the Americans have not fully committed to the war that Israel has launched, although that could be part of the plan at some point that America enters and also, initiates a bombing campaign against Iran, including hitting some of the key nuclear facilities that are deep underground. Most centrally is the Fordo nuclear reactor, which is hidden, I think, to 800 meters within a mountain in central Iran, if I'm not mistaken. So these are the cards at play. Netanyahu got his attack. I think Israeli strategy is two-pronged. It at one level, it wants to show to the Iranian population, the weakness of the regime. That's one of the elements by hitting and being full on. It wants to show some of its capabilities, specifically the advantage it has in its air force and air power more broadly. And of course, that is an advantage that is completely dependent, again, on the US and Europe, not only for spare parts, for the actual gear as well. The only thing that Israelis really do is change some of the systems and, of course, train their own air pilots. But beyond that, this is, from the bombs that they're throwing to the aircrafts that they're using, this is all based on Western and American technology more broadly. So this is what they're trying to do: deprive Iran from as much of its ballistic missiles, hit as much of the launchers, hit as many as they possible from targets within Iran, damage the nuclear reactors, and perhaps hoping, or already that's part of the plan, that America would come in the final phase of the campaign and finish off what Israel can't finish off. So these are the things, unless Israel, of course, have more tricks to play, then it will, play them at some point in the near future, and we'll see what happens in that regards. I would say that, while the attack is surprising, the manner of attack has become less surprising, in the sense that, you can see kind of the same blueprint, which is one that draws from systems theory more broadly in Israeli military thinking. Why I'm saying systems theory? Because I think that what Israel tends to do, and tries to design its kind of this operational capacity around, elements that tied to the combination of intelligence and a study of its enemies as a complex systems with with highly differential elements. And then based on these elements, they try to also penetrate these systems in different ways. You can see it, for instance, in the Hezbollah attack, where, penetrating the communication devices like the pagers or the walkie-talkies as a means through which you can target the network, for instance, and analyzing for your enemy on the basis of that network and trying to find points of entry to which you can do that. And I think one of the advantages the Israeli have with Iran is because Iran is so big, it's easier to penetrate geographically. And of course, because it also has many, if you want, internal contradictions socially. And I don't want to speak to that because I'm not an expert on Iran or know much about it. But what we can at least say from the presence of opposition to various ethnic and perhaps also religious orientation, whether in areas in Kurdistan, the Iranian part of the Kurds in Iran, or whether in different dispersed parts of Iran, that it's easily to penetrate, and that large geography also brings forth the ability to set up centers of operation even within Iran itself as you conduct attacks within it. And that's also part of what the play, at least here on some level, specifically when you have allies like Azerbaijan or others that are willing to help you or support you or provide you entry points through which you can enter, or from other areas, also the northern part of Iraq, and who knows where else. So these are the elements that are, and it's easy to find these networks internally. I think Iran has also been announcing some capture of Mossad agents within Iran itself, setting up drones, trying to create discordance, and enabling the assassination of some of the military commanders. Even after the war started, there's still some assassinations going on. So that is at least part of the level of the advantage, but that also is a disadvantage, not only because the Israeli Air Force have to engage in this kind of repetitive attack that takes them, quite far away, launching military campaigns, not only the reliance on drones that sometimes are easy also to detect, and also, of course, with some of the defensive capabilities that Iran have to actually take down, but also because even aircrafts themselves, when they're overused, they need rehabilitation, they need rest, they need you have to have a well-run logistical, not only refueling but also logistical support that is fast and can actually change spare parts and enable the complete running for the long period, so Israel will maintain its air dominance and, of course, ensure that it can hit as many targets as it can within Iran itself. Having said that, that idea of systems theory in the context of Iran, when you have this kind of large system as well, with many capacities and capabilities, and also a state with 92 million people in Iran, you have a military that is around 2 million personnel, it becomes harder to actually create that kind of inducement of shock that happened in the context, for instance, of Hezbollah, where taking out some key commanders or key leaders has an effect that is multiplied in the context of a smaller resistance movement, as happened in the context of Hezbollah. Of course, not to mention that the geographic proximity with Lebanon enables Israel to target villages in mass using various forms of weapons, which in the context of Iran is also more difficult because it cannot use lesser weapons. It needs to use its aircrafts and through these waves of attacks. And of course, the more it uses them, the more it runs the risk of course, having accidents and creating the conditions for the fall of some of their airplanes or air pilots and being captured by the Iranian military. So that is just a take. Of course, the difficulty for Iran is to sustain its actual campaign of throwing rockets, specifically with its ballistic missiles, and of course the limitations on the number of ballistic missiles it has. We don't really know how many rockets of long-range ballistic missiles Iran have. American Israeli intelligence speak of 2,000 to 3,000 of such long-range missiles with different pedigrees. The Iranians never announced how much they have. Of course, they have more or other type of missiles, including cruise missiles and others. But that remains one of the elements that Israel is also wagering on, that at some point Iran's ability to launch missiles would actually dwindle, and its ability to continue bombing Iran would actually remain intact, and that would change the balance of pain significantly in favor of Israel, and also push Iran further towards other options which might draw in other countries like the US, France, the UK, and other countries that might be tempted based on Iranian moves to actually engage directly in a military fight with Iran itself. So that's a problem that at least, or one of the elements of weakness Iran has, specifically if Israel was able to reach, as they are claiming now, launchers and ballistic missiles that are being prepared to be launched towards Israel. But this is something that remains an Israeli claim without an Iranian confirmation, at least for this at this particular moment. That would be part of the problem, because Iran, without generating, and with the neutralization, if you want, or the relative weakness that Hezbollah has, either politically in engaging in this fight, although if Hezbollah is ready for that fight, Israel will give it the opportunity to actually engage with it, not on the basis of backing Iran, but on the basis of the continued Israeli assaults in South Lebanon, and of course along all of Lebanon, as we have seen in the past couple of months, where the ceasefire really meant a lesser intensity of Israeli firing, but not its complete halt or stop. So that these opportunities will be provided, but it depends, of course, on the condition which Hezbollah has in terms of what it has in terms of weapons, or whether it can actually engage in this fight, also politically with Lebanon and other political forces within Lebanon, also besieging Hezbollah's option with that regards. So in this fight, while Iran had in any other imagined scenario, this is part of the vulnerability that Israel sensed, is that it's already neutralized Hezbollah. Therefore, it has the possibility of hitting Iran without the retaliation coming from close to its borders, which was the other offensive option that Iran had, which is significant, at least, and we know of, because there might be others that we don't know of. And now that kind of offensive option at least seems not activated for the meantime. Having said that, I think the initial Israeli successes and the initial Israeli military operation, specifically the assassination, the campaigns of assassination and the targeting of some of the nuclear facilities, have not really produced any of the strategic effects that we can speak of. And at the same time, the early Israeli high that was in the morning on Friday here, by the night was already, there was more sobering among Israeli society more broadly. And I think
I just want to, I kind of want to ask about that next, and you can, continue on. But, I think a lot of folks have said that these are the most intense strikes that Israel has really ever dealt with in a war, in terms of strikes within, Tel Aviv, Haifa, to certain points of, strategic civilian infrastructure, as well as military and, technological and energy sector. And so I'm just curious how you're seeing that red on the ground, from Israeli society, and the type of appetite that they seem to have for this sort of war, where it's not without, pain. And I mean, you raised in your piece, one of the obvious contradictions we all see, which is that you have a society that has been committing every horrific war crime for the past 20 months that we can imagine, and we've enumerated them over the last 20 months. And now they are, crying foul about, oh, well, they're attacking they hit an apartment building. And I mean, even as they're doing the same things in Iran, not to mention what they've been doing and are still doing in Gaza. And so I'm just interested in your assessment of, that end of things, of how things, what are the various responses within Israeli society that you're seeing?
Well, look, I mean, I want to tread this carefully because I think within Israeli society, there is this kind of consensus around the strategic importance of weakening and ultimately defeating Iran. And that is not only Ben Gvir and Smotrich, it is actually one area where both center left, whatever you want to call that, and center right and right wing and left wing, even in Israel, would come and create a consensus that, it's time to actually hit Iran. It's the weakest possible before Hezbollah regains its power, before, Iran can rebuild some of the, what it lost in the context of Tufan al-Aqsa, that we should deplete Iran and lead it towards, more weakening, and perhaps either to a negotiated settlement where Iran looks weak, is weakened and more contained, or even to regime change if that's possible. So I think that is one element of that there's a consensus around that. But of course, like anything else, there was a sobering when the rockets start falling. Of course, the Israeli military leadership and political leadership that took the decision to hurt and conduct this operation knew that will happen, but they still did it anyways. They will face, ballistic missiles coming in. And we should here take two things into account. First, that when Iran is actually targeting Israel, it is actually targeting a specific target. Even when it launches 40 and 50 missiles, some of these missiles are meant to actually pave the way for the missile or the 2 missiles or 3 missiles that it wants to reach a specific target, like the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, which was hit. It's one of the Israel's premier scientific research facilities and responsible for much of its research on weapons of mass destruction, among other things. Of course, like the Haifa, refinery, oil refinery that was also hit. So we're seeing, and also within Tel Aviv itself, many of the targets or the initial targets were actually tied to the Israeli Ministry of Defense within Tel Aviv itself. So these are not random targets. However, because these swarming attacks are made necessary by Israeli air defense systems. Actually, it's the failure of the air defense systems that actually, creates a condition where these missiles also hit areas around, civilian neighborhoods, etc. So I think when Iranian military is actually targeting, it's not really necessarily targeting a civilian building, but that's what happens when your own air defense systems fail. And of course, when Israel prioritizes the protection of its own military assets and facilities over, civilian domain. And that's part of the story of this, the use of these air defense system. Of course, now the cost of air defense, and the ammunition that Israel is expending daily is around $300 million, according to an Israeli estimate. Every day. This is what the war is costing, and of course it's creating havoc within Israel. Many people are actually leaving areas like Tel Aviv and heading out to more remote areas, leaving their apartments, and of course there is panic among Israeli society, specifically this morning, when also part of that psychology of entrenching yourself behind walls and behind barriers and behind air defense systems, and of course behind reinforced shelters. So what happened this morning was that one of the shelters were actually hit, and of course the people within the shelter were injured or killed. I'm not sure exactly about what happened in that context, but even that kind of reassurance that the Israelis had in the beginning, that if you're in the shelter you'll survive, that was at least slightly eroded by the attack last night. So there is some panic, there is some sobering on part of Israel that this won't be an easy, no pain war. And despite a lot of the rocket attacks that we've seen, for instance, from Hezbollah on the north, and of course, at least within the settlements that actually border the north, southern Lebanon, much destruction actually was created, and Israel was forced to evacuate much of its settlers in these areas. And until this day, not all of them have returned to these settlements as well. Despite that, this is the first time that the heart of Rosh Dan, in a very significant way, with destruction of apartment buildings, with destruction, estimates of, many Israelis are now displaced and actually cannot return to their apartments because the whole buildings have to be destroyed because they have been weakened structurally. Others have been also fell on the ground. So all of that, points out that there is that home front, if you want, fight that Israel is engaged in as well. However, having said that, I wouldn't underestimate Israeli ability and capacity to withstand nor to persevere through this. That doesn't mean that there's no pressure from this point of inflection. There is, but I don't want to exaggerate it to the extent that people think that Israel will fold because of the significance of the panic and these attacks. I would add that one of the elements that is also surprising, that Israel has closed the airport for all travel from in and out. Now, it might be a security thing, but there's an element to it that is more than security, I think. Because if anything, the Israelis like their vacations in summer, first of all. The second element of it is that despite these barrages being, coming and being significant, in fact, it's like any other element. They have early warning systems. They know the barrage is coming. They have the ability to shelter themselves before they arrive in most cases and instances. So it seems surprising that actually the airport would be closed. I think part of the reason why it's closed because, there was an element in Israeli assessment of home front that, many Israelis would choose to actually, during this war, to leave. And that would be also seen not insignificantly as something that is problematic, at least from the Israeli point of view. So I think that is part of at least the calculation. Maybe I'm misreading it, but I think that that's also part of the calculation beyond the security reasons around it.
Appreciate it. Could you talk a little bit? What is the mood among Palestinians right now? I know that there's, I'm sure, a lot of different, I know y'all are not a monolith, so I'm not asking you to speak for the trees, as it were, but how have they responded, or what responses have you seen to the events of the last few days?
Palestinians are with extreme anxiety and fear over the possibility of, a weakening of Iran and the uncertainty of this current war, where it would not only come at the disadvantage of resistance, for instance, but would enable Israel to actually complete some sort of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Gaza. So there's that one fear element. The second element, of course, is, the feelings around being jailed by a people who have occupied you, placed you under a terror regime, have exacted and destroyed systematically Gaza through its air force and air power. And of course, for many Palestinians looking at, Israeli society facing significant barrages of missiles and, seeing the destruction of their apartment buildings, they're looking at it as maybe this will sober them. Maybe this will give them a sense of what they do to other people, and perhaps that will, create some sort of awakening among them. Although I'm not sure that that will happen, but I don't hinge myself on it. But at least that is also part of the Palestinian feeling around it. Again, it's like people being imprisoned and feeling that sense of they had it coming. And of course, this is where you pointed out some of the discourses coming from Israel, specifically for international propaganda purposes, which is quite surprising and quite not only hypocritical. And when you claim, for instance, that you have the right to destroy an entire building to kill one operative, I mean, there's not a single building probably in Israel that doesn't have one soldier. No? Like, if that's the logic that you have taken to systematically create the conditions for genocide in Gaza, what do you expect? That people will sympathize with you when, or start to empathize with you when some building apartments in Israel are, targeted? I mean, look, I'm not somebody who likes blood at all. I hate war, not because I'm trying to be a pacifist, because I think war is at the end brutal. Loss is part of it, but in many instances, just like it astounds me to what extent you can be self-delusional and live within the horizon of your own delusion and make it as if it's true. It astounds you specifically when it comes to Israeli society, when you spew propaganda in a way, when you justify yourself in ways that could easily be turned against you. And there's something about it that is psychic, of course, but something about it, of course, that wants to flaunt this power, that we decide what the rules are, not other people. We decide what the exception is. We decide how the rules of the game should be played. And I don't know if Israelis will feel a sense of accountability, or like every time they'll just feel that this gives them permission to actually enact more violence and more blood across the region. But part of the story of what's happening is this kind of overextension in rhetoric, overextension in its military operation, overextension and overexhaustion of itself, not only in the eyes of the peoples of the world, but also, I think, in this context, its direct fight with Israel without American help will actually probably will turn to, I don't want to be certain about it, but will probably turn to one where at least the Israeli government that currently leads Israel falls. Because if it's not successful, if it doesn't create the condition where Iranians give up on their nuclear program, or if in any case it fails in meeting any strategic objectives, I think the current government in Israel had just created the conditions for its own fall down, because I think many will pounce on it from within. You've risked us. You didn't get the Americans on board. The Americans did not hit. You couldn't take out all the reactors. And at the same time, despite some of the successes you had in Iran, Iran is still there intact and its nuclear program is there. So that is part of the fight, is that, this risk and wager that Israel have taken might end up blowing it in its face. But not too much hope, because who knows what happens in war.
Yeah, let's talk about the American dimension a little bit, because there is obviously one. I mean, even the statements from Trump, immediately, after this, sort of gave a sense that, I gave them 60 days to make a deal, and they didn't make a deal, and so therefore, I'm okay with Israel. I mean, these are not, I'm paraphrasing here, but, he sent out tweets and things like this of basically, or true social posts, saying that, essentially he supported what Israel was doing. And, people have different assessments of, how much American intelligence was involved in this, in the initial attacks. People have, but it's quite clear that there are, unsurprisingly, forces within the right that are cheering this on, and supporting it. I mean, there's a lot of people who have been hawks on, going to war with Iran within American society, going all the way back to the Iranian Revolution, and a lot of these people have been quite consistent. And unfortunately, because of that, there's a strain of anti-Iranian propaganda that is particularly virulent in the United States that is hard to unshake. That, people, the average American does not, they have a cartoon villain in their head when they think of Iranians, basically. Um, but that you also talk in the piece about how there are some contradictions here. Certainly, as we talked about even prior to his reelection, Trump had run on this kind of, as he did the first time around, this idea of sort of withdrawing from some of these, entanglements. He hasn't been very successful with that, at all. And it seems that his actions are contradicting, that sort of claim by him, which many people said all along. I mean, Alex Avina that we had on and others has said, like, look, it's just a certain narrative, but it's out of step with reality of what the policy will actually look like. But you talk about kind of those contradictions, and there are certain people within the right. I mean, this is anecdotal, but on Twitter, I've had more right wingers who, when they realize that I'm, a communist or a socialist or a leftist, whatever they think I am, um, they say, "Oh, I'm a right libertarian. Why am I following you?" And of course it is because there is this weird overlap where there are also people on the right that are opposed to a war that could become, I mean, there were cautions early on that this could become World War III with the initial, phase post October 7th. And, we're certainly as close to that type of confrontation, I think, as we have been. And so, yeah, I mean, you write some interesting things about that in the piece. Do you want to say a little bit about what you're kind of looking at in terms of contradictions within US society, even as I'd say most Americans are not friends of Iran, unfortunately?
No, I mean, look, I don't think most Americans are friends of Iran, but I think that this 2-year genocide that Israel has committed, I think, while it finds still echoes within American society, specifically, the core Zionists within American demographics, the Christian Zionists, and of course, some other Zionists here and there within the various communities, and of course, levers of power within America itself. Slowly but steadily, this kind of awareness and consciousness that America has been, not only provisioning Israel with weapons, diplomatic cover, with complicit, material of things that people in the everyday cannot really defend. I think it also from with the right wing, there's also been increasing distaste of backing Israel no matter what, in a way that is highly foundational even to Trump's sphere. You have the Jared Kushners, the Zionists, or those who represent Zionist interests, versus the Steve Bannons and the Tucker Carlsons and the others that are engaged in this kind of factional fight over American foreign policy and influence over Trump himself. And Trump, I think, part of the style of his leadership is keeping these factions fighting, and of course, maintaining that kind of level of fulfilling parts of what both want in many ways. But it seems that he's, at least when it comes to giving the green light to Israel to commit this attack, he did. And there's 3 ways we can understand that. The first is that, also the U.S. foreign policy intelligence establishment see this as a moment of Iranian vulnerability that needs to be amplified, and therefore an Israeli attack that doesn't cost American troops any significant consequences, that could also damage Iran quite heavily and weaken it, would be advantageous to American foreign policy, and of course would also enunciate to all the Arab countries that Israel has that capacity and capability, and therefore, re-entrench Israel as a key strategic and military protector of some of the GCC states, and at the same time enable America to weaken a potential ally of China that could possibly have deeper relationship with China in the coming decade or so, which will create conditions where America would also be depriving China of one of its potential allies in the region. So there is a geostrategic logic to which America would see an attack and weakening of of Iran a means through which it can expand and ensure that it still has control over this region with little cost to itself, and using military power of Israel while backing it up logistically and through intelligence, and not really engaging the fight itself. And of course, that this war remains within that kind of managed restraint. So what I mean by that is that as long as it's an Israeli-Iranian fight with retaliation on both sides, and at the same time Iran does not go nuclear, while at the same time not touching trade routes or attacking some of the key oil facilities in the region. But that could be at any point the actual outcome of this war as it intensifies and escalates, and if possible the Americans enter the war, therefore also leading again to one of the risks that Trump would want to avoid, which is an economic recession / inflation / creating problems for the American economy, but also for European allies, and at the same time, of course, creating the conditions where some of the GCC countries could be impacted by the destruction of their oil infrastructure if the war starts, and of course if America launches an attack specifically from areas within or their bases within the GCC. Again, countries like Qatar, for instance, have an LNG factory where the gas is liquefied, but it's close to Iran, and remember, it's much easier to target these oil facilities than it is to target Israel. And of course, these also facilities and country don't have the layered air defense systems that Israel has, nor the military competences that Israel has in the same manner and full on. So I think everybody within the region, American allies, would be interested in a more contained Israeli-Iranian fight, while keeping the potential of American intervention, specifically the targeting of some of the targets perhaps that Israel can't target, because we don't know if Israel has that capacity, if it found new tactics, or if it acquired weapons that enable it to attack, for example, the Fordo nuclear facility, and avoiding that spilling towards a regional escalation that would actually create high costs for America, Europe, and others in the region as well. So there is that kind of concerted effort. I think Israel sold Trump on its ability to do this alone on some level, but at the same time, there is that risk that America would enter that war, and that would create something also more intense. Remember that the Iranians, also within their military doctrine, do not necessarily need always central command. I mean, they have also what is called mosaic defense. At some point, they could be cut down to various brigades or whatever, and create conditions where commanders on the ground have the right to do whatever they see fit without a direct command from above towards the troops on the ground. So you have elements where Iran would fight for its survival and struggle no matter what the cost, and therefore I think that there is that potential for it happening. So Israeli strategy is to use American leverage against Iran to contain the nature of the response, to sell America that it can do it on its own, and perhaps at the same time, if it's losing, the Americans might still come in to the rescue. So both if Israel is winning, the Americans don't have to interfere. If it's losing severely, or if it's being hit severely in a way that the West starts to worry over Israel, then they'll either stop the war or actually create the conditions for their direct intervention in that war. But we will see. I mean, nothing is for certain. This is until now. I mean, we could also see the end of the war at any moment, although I think that it will last at least weeks until Israel feels that it's targeted enough targets, etc. And as long as it can withstand the barrages coming in, I think that will be part of the direction of the war, that it will at least last 3 to 4 weeks, maybe longer. It depends also if the Iranians want to end it, because you can open a war. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Iranians will go along in ending it. But for now, that's how the picture looks in terms of Israel using American power as a leverage within this war to contain it, but at the same time having this kind of factional fight within American society. I'll say one thing about it, Jared, as well, is that there is that tension between America first, of course, happening, and Zionist interest within Trump administration. But I think more broadly, the idea of, and this could be the consequences of this war, the idea of backing Israel and militarily directly engaging in this war might be significant in the long term, at least in how also the right wing views Israel. If America is bogged down in a war that is lengthy, bloody, and of course creates condition for economic disturbance at home. So if Israel, because it provoked this attack, because it engaged in it, because America came to their rescue or helped with it, there is that risk that also, even within the right wing in the U.S., slowly but steadily, Zionist support will become even more confined and more restricted to its core base of ideological support that remains a minority within American society.
Right on. Something that's going on in the chat, and I don't know if this is actually occurring, but people have been saying that some of their comments are being censored. So I just want to say this comment was one that someone was worried was censored, was Israel is an outpost for the American empire. I do agree with that statement, and we've talked about that a little bit before. I think there are, as you're talking about, there can still be contradictions within parts of a global empire. And, primarily, the history of this is often between settler colonies or settler colonial projects and the metropoles. And, what, uh, you know, what the metropole is willing to do, what kind of risks it can be a more conservative posture versus a settler society, which can be more radical, not in a good way. So that, I think, is part of what we're saying. All right. One thing before we move on, and if people have questions about this, they can drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them too. But I have seen some interesting statements, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised by any of this. I'm not really surprised. It just is a little bit notable to me. Like Saudi Arabia put out a statement that was sort of, against the Israeli aggression in Iran and in support of Iran. I mean, is that just, do you read that just totally cynically or propagandistically as, they don't want the Strait of Hormuz closed and they don't want their assets targeted, so they're trying to take a posture that, create some space between themselves and what Israel is doing, and recognizing also that their own populations, seeing Israel attacking a majority Muslim state, might also, be bothered by what's going on. And there's other, I mean, there's Pakistan also, which is kind of interesting. There's some stuff that I've seen that I haven't really seen verified anywhere, that they've kind of, made some announcements perhaps behind the scenes that if, there are more countries enter on the side of Israel, that they would support Iran. Are you following those kind of things, and what do you make of them?
Well, look, I mean, I'm not sure about the whole Pakistani thing. I think that's part of Pakistan. Much was attributed to Pakistan that Pakistan didn't actually say. So let's put it that way. It doesn't mean that Pakistan is antagonistic towards Iran, but I'm not sure to the extent to which it will actually back Iran in this war, and how it will back it in this war in terms of its indirect or direct engagement. I don't see a direct engagement from Pakistan. I don't think that it will be interested in such a engagement. Remember, Pakistan, despite its close relationship with China, has also a close relationship with the U.S. At least historically, of course, it has been, placed more and more, on colder temperature, but it still maintains that kind of relationship with the Americans as well. So we'll see what happens. And Pakistan is, of course, more interested in what goes on in India rather than engaging in anything around what's going on in Iran and in the region more broadly of the Middle East. But having said that, I think when it comes to the Saudis, there has been, for years now, there has been a agreement between the Saudis, a return to diplomatic relationship, an attempt, I think, by the GCC countries, on the one hand, to kind of neutralize themselves from any direct engagement between Israel and Iran, and at the same time, to secretly cheer for Iranian weakness, at least, if not total regime change, if that's possible, or breakdown of Iran, if that's possible. And I think here there might be differences of opinion within GCC countries, between the Emirates, the Saudis, and the Qataris. It doesn't mean that there's a homogeneous, let's say, point of view, because each also has his own facilities and interests and economic infrastructure on the line. And of course, at the same time, a breakdown of Iran or a change of regime might not necessarily bring out a better outcome for trade routes and for the flow of oil from the region, because any kind of dismemberment of Iran will also create the condition for instability across the Persian Gulf. And we should remember, within the geographic bounds of the Persian Gulf, Iran controls the whole other side of the Persian Gulf, and it's not a largely distant place. It's easy for various phenomena to start to come to the fore, including piracy, including attacks from within the shore of the Persian Gulf, including a lot of other different things. If Iran also is severely economically weakened, or potentially is as all colonial and imperial designs have broken down, like Libya was broken down and Sudan was broken down, and a lot of these countries were broken down with the support of much of the GCC countries, and in this case specifically the Emirates, who plays a big role in creating kind of the conditions for civil wars and civil strife, and the backing of gangs and others. So there's that element. But I think the Saudis also have an interest in in again neutralizing themselves from this war, at least that they wouldn't receive a direct hit. That I think the Iranians would have relayed the message that they would want to hear a condemnation of this attack, and that they want to hear that the Saudis are standing firmly against it. And of course, at the same time, I think that there is interest among the GCC countries, if not actual indirect support of this war by these countries and the ruling classes on some level. There is a fear of their population, but I would say that, with the Emirates, with Qatar, with countries like Saudi Arabia, that's less of a fear than one wants to actually overblow it, because of this kind of relationship economically, specifically among the smaller GCC countries, where their own citizens have this kind of special status in their country. They get financial support from the state. There's much loyalty to the state, despite perhaps their feelings around what Israel is doing to Palestinians in Gaza, or their government's foreign policy more broadly. I think that there's no crisis, or potential for much disturbance, at least for now, in these countries, without, speaking of Saudi Arabia, which is a bigger state with a around 25 million people, and of course it has a wide Shia also a segment of its own society, specifically in the eastern provinces where actually most of the oil is. So that will be all part of the consideration. But I think the GCC countries are also, quite fearful that this Netanyahu Israeli gamble will not pay off, and that eventually, that war will hit them also in their faces if it continues, or if it reaches a point where Israel cannot really truly, at the one hand, strategically shift the equation with Iran, or weaken it to the extent, or neutralize its nuclear reactors and program, and at the same time where Iran still has the ability to really harm these states and the bases, American bases that exist there, or at least economically damage them through targeting their infrastructure, oil infrastructure, and of course closing the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb as a result.
I don't know if you've covered this, but what do you think are the considerations within Iran of not closing the Strait of Hormuz? Because I think a lot of people have called for this. It certainly makes a lot of sense in terms of the economic impact that it could have globally. But what do you think are the considerations that they're trying to think through as they assess whether something like that is something that they should do right now?
Look, I think the risk for that will come in if Iran does not have offensive capabilities against Israel. It becomes more of a prospect that Iran would go for that option. Because if once the attack was launched by Israel, Iran has multiple options in terms of how to exercise its power. It's still maintaining that kind of policy of managed, again, escalation. So, for instance, it's not throwing its entire rockets, it's rationing them, it's hitting targets in specific areas. You're hitting refineries, we're hitting refineries. You hit the Ministry of Defense or military targets, we're hitting your bases, etc. There's that level of giving Israel a taste of its medicine, but at the same time, still maintaining a rhythmic, managed escalation. Many people critique that, but this is how their strategy is. And at the same time, closing the Strait of Hormuz or the Persian Gulf, or impacting trade routes directly, at least by Iran, would be taken as a sign that America should interfere and create the conditions for their own interference in that. I don't think the Iranians are interested in going for that type of war where it's full on. I think they're trying to actually, avoid it, because they don't want much of their infrastructure, whether it's their nuclear or other infrastructure and military bases, to be targeted by American air power. But I think that that's where Israel uses the lever. Remember, we talked about this earlier, the lever of American power, and the prospect of American use it. And if the Americans do it, then I think it will be a much easier decision to make. But I think the Iranians will probably, if their ballistic missiles run out, if they cannot replace them easily, if they have a problem with, of creating the condition for a response materially and strategically against Israel, then there will be a problem. The second, response that the Iranians are probably thinking of after this attack is whether they should weaponize their nuclear program or not, and defeat Netanyahu by actually becoming a nuclear state with weapons. I'm not sure whether they have the capabilities, whether they can. According to news reports and intelligence agencies that we hear on the New York Times, etc., they have enough enriched materials for about 10 bombs or something like that. They need to test them and weaponize them. It's not an easy process. I'm not sure that's possible. If it's not possible, of course, that is all part of the game. Whether they have something also hidden, who knows? But I think that will be part of their consideration as a state at this particular moment, and that, of course, would defeat the entire purpose of, at least the entire rationale for what Netanyahu went for in launching this war, and will defeat the strategic aim of it. We'll see if that's also one of the outcomes that they'll be thinking about. But again, I think the Strait of Hormuz is like their nuclear option at this point. They will do it if they feel directly threatened by direct American military engagement. One of the problems we have seen with that is that Hezbollah tried that strategy of trying to create rules of games and engagement on some level. And what was problematic about the Hezbollah approach was that every time Israel would manage to successfully eat up some of the rule of games without even a harsher response by Hezbollah, it would only encourage the Israelis to do more rather than to do less, and to stake more and wager more on its ability to come away with, targeting personnel leadership, or targeting Hassan Nasrallah himself, or engaging in this military fight. That is part of what people say. I'm not sure if that's also a correct assessment, because it assumes that Israel was testing. I do think that there was a test, in the sense of, what do you guys have? Show us, because we want to make our assessment based on perhaps things that we haven't really knew about you as an organization, or weapons that you have that we might not have knew about, or the willingness to go full on that we haven't really studied before, or there was that element to it. But at the same time, I'm not sure they wouldn't have committed a lot of these attacks if they had the capabilities and the capacity to do it. I mean, the Israelis, even if they Hezbollah reacted more harshly, or along those sides. I think sometimes people exaggerate the extent to which that would have created a deterrence as well in the minds of Israelis, or not. But who knows? I mean, this is the play game. It's still how the Iranians are viewing this. And I think part of their objectives at this current moment is to keep it a fight with Israel. It's not to actually draw in the Americans or to draw in others, but they might fail anyway. So, and you can always close the Strait of Hormuz even if they fail. Now, the other side of it, of the calculation, if you do close it, whether that will put, whether that will call the bluff of Trump, whether, will you risk them coming in and, attacking, nuclear facilities, or, throwing these bunker busters into Fordo, and creating that damage that Iran would take years to rebuild if it's able and capable of rebuilding in its nuclear program, if that's possible. So these are all, part of what's going on behind closed door in the strategic thinking of the Iranians and others. But, this is part of the current tit for tat and the retaliation the Iranians are doing. I think as long as they have this kind of effective offensive action against Israel and against its home front and against assets, whether military or civil infrastructure or key strategic infrastructure within Israel, like oil refineries, etc., as long as they have that, they will, I think, use that at this particular juncture, alongside perhaps other tactics that they might use, including covert operations or anything of that sorts, if they have the capabilities.
Appreciated. Yeah, I just want to say I've seen reports of both this, the USS Nimitz and its strike group, moving back to the Middle East. It sounds like it was confirmed by U.S. officials. And there's also, people have noted that all of the U.S. fueling tanker planes and stuff like that have started to move in that direction as well. And so, it's interesting, because on one level you have Trump, sending out his posts today about, there needs to be a a ceasefire, or that they have to come to some agreement like India and Pakistan did, recently. And at the same time, he's deploying military assets there, and that's, I think, par for the course of what we've seen of it's par for the course probably for the Biden administration too, but the Trump administration of saying on one end that you want peace and whatever, and at the same time taking actions that are clearly pro-militaristic and so on. And I mean, even the negotiation point around Iran and its nuclear enrichment program and whatnot, it's like Israel does this attack, obviously with the approval of the United States. They wouldn't have done it if it was, if the United States said don't do it. And at the same time, then Trump says, yeah, now maybe we can have that negotiation, so it reminds a lot of Ghassan Kanafani talking about the negotiation between the sword and the neck. So let's shift, and if people have other questions, you feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to grab some others at the end if we can. I'm imagining, Abood, you're working on little sleep from all of these air raid sirens and things like that at the nighttime.
Well, we don't have sirens
well, can you hear the Israeli sirens?
Sometimes. Well, I'm a deep sleeper, so generally I don't like I wake up to things. I don't really live them, at least at night. But yeah, I mean the last barrages, they were they could become very noisy. So but yeah, I mean I sleep through things. Once an Apache helicopter, Jared, shot a rocket near my house, and I just slept through it. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad that the Zionists are not disrupting your sleep.
No,
even as Iran
I'm just staying up later. That's the
yeah. All right. Anyway, the piece I want to shift to a little bit is the more recent of. It's not the most recent piece you wrote, because the most recent piece you wrote, and the links of all of these are in the show description, was about Iran and about this war that we're talking about. But before that, you wrote two pieces, and the more recent of those two pieces was titled "In Israel's Gangsters in Gaza." Israel has long used undercover forces posing as Palestinians to sow strife. Today, it is using this strategy again in Gaza in the form of gangs taking control over humanitarian aid. The goal is to fragment and dismember Pakistani society. I mean, Palestinian society. Maybe I need more sleep. So why don't you talk a little bit about this piece? I thought it was really, really a good piece and a good overview of both this strategy, but also helping people understand what is going on here with this, Abu Shabab led gang which is really an Israeli-led gang in Gaza. And so could you just give people the context of what's happening and what do you see as the purpose of this operation, I guess I would call it?
I mean, look, there's this larger perhaps point of how colonial violence could easily become internalized, turn inwards, and become forms of a civil strife within societies that are being colonized. And this is not new in Palestinian society. Historically speaking, we had the peace brigades even before 48 that worked alongside British interest in Palestine. Various experiments with various forms of collaboration with Zionism or British imperialism have been done in the context of Palestine. They take different forms, shapes. They're not always at the same level. Some come from this kind of fantasy, Orientalist fantasy that some Israeli experts on Palestinian society have, like assessing us as tribal society, that therefore you can build alliance with some tribes, or Arabs are a patriarchal society, so you need to talk to their elders, or things along those lines. And that was more one of the most famous examples of that is what is called the village leagues, that was experimented with in the 1980s. Now, recently, I mean, Israel has had this kind of phenomena within Palestinian citizens of Israel. Those citizens, those segment of Palestinian society that Israel flaunts as being equal citizens to the Jewish citizens in their propaganda. In fact, I mean, they live in many of these villages where, based on the class, if you want, position of much of the Arab society and the ghettoization of these villages and the inability to expand further, of course, while backing up some of, the troublemakers within these societies, the criminals, to form more cohesive forms of gang and criminal networks, Israel has managed to create, or at least permit, the rise of crime and organized crime within the society, specifically in the past decade. And we've seen, for instance, among Palestinian citizens of Israel, at least, 100 to 200 Palestinians killed every year from gang-related violence within the villages and towns among Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I think part of that idea of backing up gangs that either have some sort of familial basis or creating at least conditions that whereby these gangs only operate within Palestinian society within Israel, but does not impact the Jewish segment of Israeli society in any meaningful way. And that's part of, like, if you want, the norm of how these gangs operate, that they only kill Arabs, that they're only engaged in criminal activities within Arab communities, that they have their influence is restricted to these areas. And of course, that's part of like a policing, but also part of the Shabab, which is the Israeli intelligence service, internal intelligence service. The police fails to police, the Israeli police, and at the same time, the Israeli intelligence networks backs these gangs and provision it with the ability to also operate sometimes in the favor of of the Shabak by providing information on people, or perhaps sometimes even conducting quiet assassination of key activists or people who have a respectability within Palestinian society within Israel, but still have some sort of nationalist ethos. So, the idea of gangs is not new. And it's not surprising that Israel would come to Gaza and within the Rafah area, of course, with people like Yasser Abu Shabab, who's a known criminal, a drug, smuggler, within the border communities like Rafah, which had historically a relationship with the Sinai tribes, etc., and therefore also with a lot of smuggling networks, and was also a prisoner in the Hamas when Hamas was in government before the war, within the prisons locally, that they would find among some of the gangsters, some of those, harmed by, if you want, the Palestinian government within Gaza in the past 17 years, some willing collaborators who, on the one hand, want to have social symbolic power within their society, but also at the same time, basing it on using the Israeli power against their, historic enemies. This whole police and criminal type of relationship where the criminal now has a nuclear state that backs him. So this is part of the story of what happened with the creation of these gangs, not only in Rafah here but across Gaza itself. I think perhaps with some tacit support from some elements within the Palestinian Authority, or more broadly from even Arab states that might be backing such a project that would establish some sort of armed presence, create the condition for a more civil war within Palestinian society, and at the same time redirect the energies from fighting Israel towards also these new forces working closely with Israel. And that could help actually tactically with some operations of the Israeli army by, being spotters, by engaging in military fight with Al-Qassam Brigade or the resistance in Gaza more broadly. So they have these kind of functional roles. But I think what Israel wanted from these gangs is mostly the ability to sow chaos, to create a local Palestinian address through which they can mediate with Palestinian society in Gaza, create a much more active collaborationist network within the Gaza Strip as well, provision this kind of specter of civil war, and of course disrupt the provisioning of aid and making sure that criminal gangs take over it, and therefore can also finance themselves through this kind of aid economy that they're creating, providing them with the power that, you know, desperate people in Gaza, hungry, who want access to food or who want, you know, some sort of exit from Gaza, or who want whatever their everyday needs is, that will have a local Palestinian address that, you know, might happen. This is, again, not something new. So you have the gang element and you have the empowerment by becoming kind of the local Israeli voice within your society. For instance, I'll just give an example to make that, you know, clearer. When, you know, you live here and you want a permit to work in Israel because you need to make money to feed your family, you know, you might have, I don't know, some security file and you want it to disappear. So you try to talk to somebody to give you clearance, a security clearance. If Israel appoints somebody, or you know that that somebody is close to the Israelis, they start becoming, or they have some sort of power within Palestinian society by their proximity to Israeli power. This is what Abu Shabab also represents. However, I think in many ways it's not as, you know, successful as the Israelis wanted, because despite the fact that it's creating the conditions for like the spectacle of infiltration, the attempt at fragmentation of Palestinian society, and even with the empowerment of some elements within the idea that Israel is committing daily massacres on the one hand. The second thing, these gangs don't have political cover. They're known criminals or know people who are not necessarily, you know, the Palestinian society in Gaza is not necessarily receptive to. And at the same time, they're both, you know, they're not close to, you know, even the political rivalry of, you know, of elements within Fatah that might, you know, come to the fore and play that type of role that might be seen more legitimate in the eyes of Palestinians in Gaza more broadly. So I think because they're quite naked and bare, they do have an element where their legitimacy and ability to actually really penetrate and influence Palestinian society would remain quite restricted, with little power over it. This, and moreover, they're also participating in violence against their own people in many instances, specifically at aid distribution sites where they're present. And therefore, I think that type of engagement will only erode their power more broadly. So while there are phenomena that, you know, we could look at and perhaps study, the fact that it would, you know, the idea that it would be able to replace resistance or become sort of, you know, element of where Palestinians in Gaza might start to shift their loyalties towards, I think is over exaggerated. I think that they remain an isolated phenomena that could easily be defeated, you know, by the resistance, of course, if the Palestinians in the Gaza persevere more broadly. But that, having said that, of course, the other thing is that Israel, at the end of the day, does not want to create a conditions for stability. It just wants to create more chaos. So that's a problem with its use of these gangs, is that on the one hand, you know, it's not an alternative on which to build a different political or social economic order, but only a disruptive element that wants to create conditions for crisis, disorientation, and chaos, and fragmentation, and the spectacle of which, including the spectacle of infiltration. So I think that the way Israel is also want to use those gangs will, in fact, not help it defeat, as it claims, the resistance in Gaza, but only serve its wider project of ethnic cleansing and genocide as it intends. So there's something quite tragically in the acceptance of these people to work for Israel, is that even their hiring by Israel is quite temporary and it will not last for a long time.
Appreciated. I think we can kind of move from there into the other piece. And again, we can go back if there's things people want us to catch. I saw a couple comments in the chat that we can bring back up in a minute. But this is the chaos of aid distribution in Gaza is not a system failure. The system is designed to fail. Israel is using the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to condense Palestinians into increasingly narrow enclaves, forcing displacement through need. We are witnessing the rise of a new authoritarianism where aid sites double as kill zones. And then, as you write in the first sentence, we are not witnessing a rupture with how things used to be. So talk about the kind of continuity that you are assessing there, but also the reality of what's going on the ground with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, in these moments recently.
Well, look, I mean, what we should say is that humanitarianism have always played a role, of making imperial violence legible, no? So it's not new that there's a relationship between humanitarianism, humanitarian law, and the ways through which American imperial powers and colonial powers more broadly try to make their violence legitimate through proclamations, for instance, of self-defense or provision or proportionality or courageous restraint and other things along those lines that, much of these colonial powers have used. So there's that intimate relationship between humanitarian logics of war and, of course, making occupation permanent and prolonged, like in the context of Palestine. We've lived through that intimate relationship where Israel, for instance, administratively detains people, but still manages somehow to speak of administrative detention through logics of military occupation and rules of war as applicable to occupied territories, while still building settlements within the occupied territories and violating its provisions within humanitarian law more broadly, using human shields, for instance. So you have that close relationship. It's always been there. Even at times you would see conferences within Israel that actually brings together elements from within the international humanitarian organizations and Israel itself, working closely on logics of war, on restraint, on what it means to engage in war at this particular moment. And of course, Israel has always had, at the same time, benefited from this kind of architecture of norms, laws that emerged after the Second World War, in which, after it finished the ethnic cleansing of 78% of Palestine in 1948, destroying more than 500 villages, kicking out most of the Palestinians out of what is now Palestine 1948, as we say in Arabic. So that it came to the fore and made itself legible and legitimate through these application or attempt to applying this norm, and of course suspending them whenever it wants and then returning them whenever it wants. I think that in the past 20 years specifically, as it confronted resistance movements that have engaged with it in this kind of dialectical relationship where air power is met with the subterranean, for instance, infrastructure, where Israeli, systems analysis of those resistance movements includes that it needs to actually create an efficient killing machine, as Aviv Kochavi, the previous head of the Israeli or the previous chief of staff of the Israeli military proclaimed. It means that it needs to actually transgress every norm of war. Not that Israel never did that, but it needs to transgress it en masse, and in a way where also it's not only about hitting pagers, for instance, or walkie-talkies, or creating the condition for assassination of key commanders and leaders in whatever resistance movement it's targeting, that resistance emerges from society, and therefore that you need to actually exact a heavy price from that society by destroying homes, by destroying buildings. And we saw that policy being applied both in Gaza and, of course, in the context of Gaza. It takes a specific form where there's also this intention being driven towards ethnically cleansing it and paving the space for replacement of the indigenous local population of Palestinians by, Israeli Israeli settlers in the future, and creating the Trump Riviera, as Trump placed it front and center in his own proclamation, but also creating this kind of new Israeli coastline cities and settlements within that area, but also in Lebanon, where you don't stop in terms of engagement with military on hitting targets but you actually calibrate the massacres and destruction, including almost a total destruction of many villages in southern Lebanon, as Israel committed in the current war. So what we're seeing is that Israel wants to actually unleash or redefine, reformulate the entire logic of humanitarianism by still trying to create some sort of equation where it's still legible within it. And that's why we see, for example, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that it established alongside American contractors and mercenaries, that you're still appropriating the logic of humanitarianism, but weaponizing it in a way that gives you more advantage in the control of how much food, where it's distributed, to whom it's given, and on what conditions it's given. So what I mean by that is that Israel is creating, first of all, a spectacle of humiliation, the design of a new massacre through bringing people out to take the food and then killing them and shooting them every time that they actually come to the fore, and at the same time provisioning enough food through which Gaza society would be fighting over. So instead of having a famine where everybody's equally hungry, for instance, you have the inequality of hunger emerging as part of the social and moral and political fight internally, therefore leading to even further erosion of Palestinian ability to withstand the assault by Israel. If you ask many Palestinians in Gaza, that might be even harder than the massacres that they're facing on a daily level. How people turn against each other, fighting for survival, how people they expected that they wouldn't actually engage. I don't know if you can see me well or.
It just cleared up. It was like fuzzy for a second there, but go ahead.
Yeah. So instead of engagement and instead of like when Israel's killing you, it's one thing. The second thing is that you fear your life, etc. The second thing is people disappointing you, people fighting for survival, people becoming more selfish or perhaps less communal about how they act and less capable of acting in a way that withstand. That induces, if you want, that kind of inequality of hunger, of course, creates an economy around it. And this is where I think Israel needed to subvert the system, the old system of UN agencies and international agencies, not because only it records, not only because it archives a lot of the crimes that Israel is committing, which is one part of it, but because as well it had this pretension of neutrality and objectivity and of handing aid to everybody that Israel didn't want to actually happen, and it pressures Israel to do more. But again, still Israel is subscribing to this logic of the need for food to enter Gaza, and we should know that actually is only meant to prolong the war, because if no drop of food enters Gaza, then you will have more outcry over how you're killing 2.2 million people through hunger. As long as enough food and enough resources make it to Gaza, you can still commit the massacres while maintaining that kind of humanitarian logic. And this is why, in my piece, I think, while Israel subverts, kind of unconceals, I think what it tells us about this kind of twinning between Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and Israel, how easily it has been historically to twin humanitarian logics with war and making it legible and legitimate, and at the same time, how Israel as a state is also exceptionalizing itself, subverting the old order. And this is why, on some level, we can see it as a consummation, as this kind of naked unconcealment, which I think is one part of this war where Israel in large part has been acting in ways where even when it finds collaborators, they're like the type that, unconceal all forms of collaboration. Even, if we take Abu Shabab and you think about the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, you can see also elements of, if you want, gang-like a structure that exists within the Palestinian Authority itself, the way it extracts, if you want, taxes, manage Palestinian society, but serves eventually Israeli interests, including the containment and pacification of the West Bank. And at the same time, in Abu Shabab, you see the phenomena of being naked in front of you. A criminal, drug smuggler slash somebody who's a social outcast, not really protected by family, not by tribal allegiances, not by any nationalist ethos or nationalist political party, doesn't have that cover, but, is acting as a gang, declaring himself to be large part a gang and nothing else and nothing more. Of course, he's not declaring himself. He's saying that he has cover from the Palestinian Authority. Of course, the Palestinian Authority denies it. But in essence, we've seen that phenomena of how this war or this genocide is obscene in many ways, how it reveals and uncovers, the sadistic nature of Israeli violence, the taking pleasure in killing, the taking pleasure in destruction, and the systematic way that through which they've released videos of them celebrating, with women lingerie and celebrating the destruction of homes, universities, etc. So there's this element of everything being totally naked without a lot of ideological blinders or covers. And in that sense, also the humanitarian logic has that element of being at least naked here. And we see in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation some sort of consummation of, the logic of humanitarianism more broadly.
Appreciate that. That was a great breakdown. I've been, folks who follow me on social media know that I share a number of different campaigns from people in Gaza that, are asking for outside support. And one of the things I noticed particularly in recent weeks is just people from who have GoFundMe's and things like this, like sharing stories of going out and trying to seek aid, particularly during this period where the internet was down, right? And so they couldn't share their own campaigns. And for some of them, it was the first time, going to these places since Gaza Humanitarian Foundation took over it, and just talking about how humiliating an experience it was, to the degree that they're actually saying, look, we will all starve at home, me and my children and my family, before we go back to do that, because it is just so awful. And, people just fighting over bags of flour, basically, because they are so desperate, right? And are made so desperate by this particular structure of aid distribution, which, of course, to be clear, as you laid out, I mean, it is something that Israel created and has admitted to creating with the, support of, as you say, certain, mercenaries, international war contractor folks, a lot of U.S. involvement as well. And, there's been so many different, red lines that have been crossed during this genocide. And I appreciate you drawing both to the fact that the normal humanitarian construct in Gaza and in situations of war is also, a part of the war apparatus in general, and that it is not something, liberatory and to be celebrated in and of itself. But even this is just like to take it to its most, horrible conclusion. And I think also it does, like so many other things, set a precedent that I imagine won't be the last time that we that we see this in wars now, because unfortunately now you have an acceptance by a lot of people of allowing, Israel and its supporters to put something like this in place. And allow it to take hold. A couple of questions people had in relation to this are whether the GHF taking over the aid distribution, does it mean that UNRWA is now effectively out of commission? How do the other NGOs and institutions that have been a part of Palestinian civil society within Gaza, as well as aid distribution and schools and so on, how are they, what is their posture, and is there any utility to them at all in this moment?
Look, I can't really give a complete breakdown of that, to be honest, but I do think that their posture is that they're now being denied at least one element of distribution of aid. Many of these organizations do a lot of other things, so some of them are still present beyond distribution of food packages or things like that some of them have been engaged in for some time. It includes conducting programs. There's still active participation by some institution, I don't know, with psychosocial health, with a lot of these programs that they create, like distributing tents, providing people with support, medical relief, things like that is still ongoing in Gaza. But at least when it comes to food distribution, which I think for the Israelis was a key element of their strategy to attempt to kill Gaza more broadly. So that is one element they wanted to take over from these institutions and deprive them, because it's not only, they were not satisfied with only maintaining a limit on what form of food comes in, but how do we create a new venue for humiliation, distribution, and of course also not bringing that much food in the first place, still keeping people in many instances in that condition of almost famine, but no famine, in the large sense of the word, always on the verge of hungry, but still capable of surviving. It's something similar again to when they capture a Palestinian prison, capture a Palestinian, for instance, activist, and put him in interrogation and allow minimal amount of food where he can still confess, but at the same time doesn't completely die. At least that's the equation. You keep them at the weakest condition, and that's what Israel has been doing, alongside a lot of the elements that come with the inequality of hunger, who gets aid, who doesn't get aid, who has flour, who doesn't have flour, who gives who flour. People are when people speak from Gaza, they speak about these different things beyond the prices of much of these food. A lot of people are also going there. I mean, some of them are people taking out aid because they want to sell it. I mean, it's also a form of business within Gaza itself, through which people are making money. It's not only people going there out of desperation. So there's these fights, there's like interest material on the ground on it. But I'll say something, in Palestinian society more broadly, while there are a lot of stories of disappointment and people fighting over things, in fact, part of, let's say, the moral orientation of our society is so resistant to unethical behavior that it's shocked when it sees it. It's not normalized. That's why while people have some sort of course, after a year or around 2 years now of massacres and war and hunger, in Gaza you would still see a lot of internal support and social cohesiveness, much more than perhaps another society going the same conditions within the same period. This is not to provide a romantic picture of what's going on, no, but it's just to say that we tend to speak of these things in shock, because we tend to think of these type of ethical deviations to be problematic because of this kind of collective conservative communal values that Palestinians more broadly have, coming from the religious and of course village-oriented, peasant-oriented values that are still quite prevalent within our society. Not totally, not completely, but that's part of the equation, at least when it comes to Palestinian society in Gaza as well. So despite these, elements of humiliation, etc., that are part of that picture and spectacle, as you said, there are vast numbers of Palestinians in Gaza that would not be willing to even go to these aid distribution centers. There's vast numbers in Gaza that would just, choose another way to find means to survival. There's a lot of communal sharing of resources as well. And there's also at times people who don't share, or people who do things that perhaps shouldn't be done. But that's part of what Israel is trying to do, is to induce that moment of collapse within Palestinian society. And let's hope that they're not successful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to ask a question. This is kind of a geostrategic question a little bit, because I don't think we really touched on this element going back a little bit to Iran. Although I don't know that Alex was asking this question just about Iran, but thoughts on China and Russia's intervention or non-intervention. Of course, I asked what intervention, and he said yes, exactly. But some folk with good analysis, like Arnaud Bertrand, sorry if I mispronounced his name, talked about why China won't intervene, and it's because they have a non-interventionist policy. I'm curious about this. I mean, obviously, we've watched China not intervene in terms of the genocide in Gaza in any kind of direct way, other than, as we talked about months and months ago, hosting a kind of diplomatic summit between different factions of Palestinian society and so on, and maybe a few statements. But at the same time, they have also, as people have pointed out, done business with Israel amid this genocide, and really haven't taken a posture that's very strong in support of Palestinians, for sure. I'm more, I guess, interested because we have those 20 months of information about how they would behave there, to Iran, because I think Iran is seen as more of a geostrategic asset to China, as well as to Russia, as that question posed. Obviously, Russia is also embroiled in its own not long-standing, but several year long now war with Ukraine, and NATO, the NATO bloc. So do you have any sense or any thoughts on their posture towards Iran right now, and whether they might play a supportive role at all, as beyond their typical one, which is that they continue to do trade with Iran and so on?
Well, look, I do think that I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to speak to something that, around the limits of, for instance, Russian support, whether Russia will want to play a mediating role, whether China will pressure through to reach a settlement. I think both Russia and China will push for, a fast and rapid end of this war for multiple reasons, including, in the case of China, the fear of what it means also on its economy, the disruption of oil coming from the Persian Gulf. But at the same time, any significant weakening of Iran will also deprive China in the future, within the geostrategic alliance systems that are being constructed and broken down and reconstructed, one of its perhaps primary allies moving forward, that has a dispensation towards an anti-hegemonic stance against American power more broadly in the world. So I think the Chinese will be vested. I'm not sure what character that means. I don't think they will. Of course, I don't think they will directly engage militarily, but whether it will reach, economic relief, things around, weapon replacement, whether it will reach levels of providing Iranians with some weapons systems. Who knows? I mean, but I don't think that the Chinese will completely stand on the fence if they feel that the Iranians are weakened in a way that would become problematic, and Iran would be broken down into bits and pieces. Now, I'm hinging here. I'm not sure you should listen to me on this, but that's at least my sensibility, of the Chinese. I think Russians are too involved in their own war. They've already proven that they also need support in their own war. I mean, the Iranians were giving support. I think perhaps the Iranians will now ask for some support back in terms of maybe weapon system, in terms of other things going on. But at the same time, I'm not sure to what extent Russia is capable and willing to do that, or whether it will hinge its support also on what America and Israel are also asking from it at this particular point. But I do think that they have a interest in not losing a key ally, or not significantly weakening Iran in ways that would be harmful. But I think thus far the war, as it's shaped up, it's still not reaching that kind of worrying level for them. But we'll see what happens down the road when it comes to their intervention, and where it would go in terms of direction. But the Chinese statement was quite clear. They stand with Iran. They've and so is the Russians. They were quite clear, of course, asking for de-escalation in both cases. But their direction and orientation is more towards Iran. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, I totally agree on that point. Max Isle, again, thinking about his analysis of global politics, strategy and so on, he always points out that, even within the axis of resistance, that Iran obviously is an important node, and that even within Iran's capability to support the axis, obviously China and Russia in their own ways are important to it. If we take this kind of geostrategic understanding to understand that if Iran was totally isolated, that it could not support these different actors right in the region and so on. And so I think the question is whether now that Iran is at a position where people might, I don't know yet whether this is existential for Iran. I mean, I don't think it is quite yet, but there are people who are very afraid of that, and I think we should take it seriously, as you have as well. But I think that at that point, it raises the question of also very much the China, Russia, their own geostrategic positioning as well. And I think that, like you said, it makes sense certainly that they would support with, providing systems and logistics and whatever they can in that sense. China does not, I don't know the last time that China actually provided military support to another country, but it's been decades, I think, at this point. So yeah, appreciate that.
Well, it doesn't have to be military. Sometimes it's about some forms of microchips. Sometimes it's the need for precision guided missiles. You need some elements, components. There's details there that is not about necessarily an entire weapon system, but they do. For example, Pakistan has many Chinese systems, and they use them against India. So we'll see when it comes to Iran what they will offer or not offer, and to what extent they would just sit on the sidelines while diplomatically backing Iran, or whether that backing will also entrench itself and deepen itself as the war progresses.
Yeah, appreciate it. I don't know the answer to this, whether Iran was promised some equipment from Russia. There was a recent kind of agreement that was announced that wasn't too clear on what was included in it, I think. And then I heard some stuff about maybe missile defense systems and so on, or air defense systems. So that's a possibility as well. Yeah. There's
air defense systems. The Iranians have been also providing the Russians with drones. that they've been using. I mean, the Iranians have also their own self-established manufacturing base for much of their own weapon systems. So, but there are some complementary elements that China and Russia, specifically elements that tie to the need to either increase the production of missiles for replacement, or for missiles to be imported directly from these countries, or to enhance their air defense systems more broadly. So the Russian systems were already in Iran. I think the discussion was on S-400, and I'm not sure if Iran got it or not. But in the initial blow, Israel claimed to have taken out much of its air defense systems, which the Iranians, of course, deny as well. So, I mean, I'm not sure what is happening behind the closed doors on the Russian-Iranian relationship and how it will go forward. But I still think that the Russians and the Chinese have an interest in making sure Iran does not fall. That's the underlying element there.
Yeah, I should say too, as we're doing this live, Israel struck the Iranian state television building, and they were off the air briefly, and then they're broadcasting live, even amid all of that. And so, it's just, again, I don't know, I just wanted to share that. I mean, it's quite notable, and there's a lot of people sharing the images of both that strike, which happened as they're live on the air, and then them coming back on the air afterwards as well. So this was a question I saw on social media yesterday, whether Netanyahu is in Greece right now or out of the country. Do you have any have you been following his whereabouts?
No, I mean, he's, I think, here because he turned up in the sites where I don't know who released this rumor. Maybe he was, I don't know. I mean, I don't keep up with the Netanyahu's movements, but at least there was yesterday pictures of him and videos of him near the site where a missile hit in the greater Tel Aviv area. So yeah.
One other question somebody had was around this is about Abu Shabab and the drugs, where they come from, and then concerning them, is there a significant addiction situation in Palestine? It's something we rarely hear about, and enslavement is a big tool of the colonizer. Are there many addicts, and how is communal reaction? So, just as you were talking about drug smuggling and that sort of stuff, I think that was when those questions came up.
Well, the number one drug in Palestine is tobacco, as you guys. No, I mean, there is drug use.
We're delaying Aboud getting to a cigarette right now.
No, it's okay. But I think that generally speaking, I don't have concrete numbers or anything on the drug addiction in Palestine, but I wouldn't say that this is one of the most pressing problems in our society. Let's put it that way. There is some drug abuse like anywhere else. In Gaza, I think large part of drugs were smuggled from Egypt mostly, but also it wouldn't be surprising to me that some elements from within Israel would also be involved in drug smuggling into Gaza as well, through the borders between Gaza and Israel as well. So there might be these elements. I mean, there is drug abuse, but again, it's not one of the most pressing. There are areas in Palestine where drug abuse take more of a larger role in people's, if you want, life, specifically in neighborhoods like around Jerusalem, for instance, where there's more intensive use of drugs, also accessibility, or synthetic forms of drugs that are also making in this society, specifically cheap ones, or in villages and towns within communities, Palestinian communities within Israel, there might also be more of drug abuse. Also in the West Bank there is, but again, I mean, it's not like there's a communal response to it. There's a lot of discouragement morally, religiously, socially, but also from political parties around drug use. Most, for instance, political parties in Palestine, if you use drugs, you're not allowed to be a member. You know, things like that. There's a lot of anti, if you want, drug sentiment. It also, stigmatizes you as a person. It creates, a social stigma around you. So, if somebody smokes, for instance, marijuana here, he becomes a hashash in Arabic, which is like somebody who's looked at in a specific lens as somebody who has a moral failing. So there's a lot of inhibitions against that form of abuse. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or that it's not slowly but steadily also increasing, perhaps. But of course, this is all based on impressions, and you shouldn't take it with any objective scientific seriousness, at least.
Well, no, but I mean, I appreciate those thoughts and insights. Do you have anything else that you wanted to get to?
No, I mean, yeah, that's it. In my mind, I think we covered everything.
We covered quite a bit. And thank you. I definitely encourage people always to follow your writing. Or you seem like you're basically a columnist at Mondoweiss at this point. Are you doing regular stuff for them at this point?
I mean, I'm writing whenever I feel like writing, but yeah, I mean, I have, I've sometimes I write, sometimes I don't, but I don't have like a regular column, but they welcome my pieces. So as long as they welcome them, I'm happy. So,
well, I'm grateful to them for continuing to publish your work, and you for continuing to write and coming on and talking to us about your work and your analysis. Again, I just want to underscore again for folks, Samir Project is as good of a place as you can support. It is an initiative that is led by Palestinians in Gaza, supported by some folks within the diaspora. They have a number of different initiatives you can support. And look, they treat folks in a very dignified fashion, as well as they are doing their work. And I think unfortunately, again, if people missed it, one of their important coordinators on the ground, Mossab, was killed yesterday by Israel. And they are obviously in mourning, but I encourage people to support them and that project. It's a great way to, and also I think it gets people out of, sometimes I hear people, and I think this is less of a concern now, but they're like afraid to give to an individual campaign because they don't know if it's legitimate or whatever. And I hope that that's a less of a concern for people at this point. But I think that if you give it to them, not only that it's getting to folks, they're also not an NGO, so they don't take any kind of cut from what people donate, and they try to do it as democratically as possible, ensuring that people can get support that wouldn't be able to go out and get support for themselves, and so on. And so anyways, I just want to underscore that again as we get out of here. Aboud, again, thank you so much for your work and for your time, my friend.
thank you, Jared.